Hello, Everyone Below is a true story that took place during the 20th century. An elderly woman with silver hair sat quietly at her 80th birthday party, organized by her children, all of whom were military veterans. One of them stepped forward and presented a special gift, the very first love letter their father had ever sent from the battlefield. Rewind the memory. In 1972, a young woman named Eleanor May, just 22 years old, worked as a nurse at a military hospital in California. There she met John Carter, a Marine who had just returned from Vietnam with severe injuries. They fell in love while he was still bandaged and healing, and got married right before he redeployed. The brutal stretch of marriage, the struggle Eleanor had to raise 4 children on her own, while John continued to serve in multiple war zones, first Iraq, then Afghanistan. She once considered divorce completely overwhelmed, worn down by the coldness of a husband who had grown too used to discipline and war. One time, Eleanor collapsed right on the kitchen floor from sheer exhaustion, and her oldest son, just 10 years old, cooked the first meal ever for the entire family. Every letter she sent, though John never replied, was carefully kept in his military trunk, preserved like a hidden piece of his soul. The emotional twists, midpoint shift. After retiring, John suffered from post-war trauma, PTSD. He stopped speaking, became violent, angry. Eleanor stayed up every night reading the Bible aloud, hoping to pull him out of the darkness. Their children all enlisted, not out of pressure, but because they believed in the values their parents had lived by. The emotional climax. At a Veterans Honor Ceremony in Washington, D.C. John Carter unexpectedly was called up. But instead of walking toward the stage to receive his medal, he turned to face Eleanor, who was crying among the audience. He stepped forward, knelt down, and spoke the words, buried in silence for 40 years. I served this country, but you're the one who kept our family from falling apart. The fulfilling ending. Resolution. The final scene. A 3-generation family reunion. John and Eleanor, their 4 veteran children, and their spouses and grandchildren all gathered for Christmas. John and Eleanor danced a slow dance to the old tune from decades ago. She said, "It's been long and hard, but my love, it was worth it." Message and core values of the story. Love is a long battle not meant for the faint of heart. A strong home front is a victory with no medals, yet it saves entire generations. The sacrifice of American women after the war deserves to be honored just like the heroes on the battlefield. If you're watching this and feel moved by the story, please give us a like and consider subscribing. Eleanor May Carter's 80th birthday party was held in a small wooden house nestled at the edge of a pine grove in rural Colorado. The room was warm, lit by flickering candles, reflecting off faded photo frames on the wall. On the table, freshly baked pies made by her youngest granddaughter, steamed with the rich scent of butter and cinnamon. Everyone gathered around chatting and laughing except Eleanor, who sat silently by the window, her eyes fixed on the quiet snowfall outside, as if listening to an old melody drifting in from the past. Her eldest grandson, now a Navy officer, walked up beside her, holding a small box wrapped in velvet. "I found this in Grandpa's old trunk," he said. "I think it's meant for you." Eleanor opened the lid with trembling hands. Inside was a weathered letter. Its corners curled the paper thin with age, but the handwriting still clear. "To Eleanor, the only person who ever made me feel human again." She placed her hand over her heart and closed her eyes. The room fell silent. When she opened them again, her voice was soft as the wind. "I met your grandfather in 1972, in a room filled with pain and the smell of antiseptic. Back then, I was just a trainee nurse, and he was a soldier back from Vietnam, wounded in the leg with eyes that had already died halfway. Camp Pendleton was a world of its own then. The men returning from war carried more than bandages. They brought back ghosts, burdens, and a silence so heavy it filled the air. John Carter wasn't like the other soldiers. He didn't complain, didn't scream. He just stared blankly at the ceiling for hours unblinking. There was something in his stillness that scared Eleanor and pulled her in. The first time she came to change his dressing, he didn't look at her. Just nodded when she said, "I'll be gentle, Sergeant." He didn't respond. But when she touched his wound, he gripped the bed rail until his knuckles bled. She realized then this man wasn't afraid of pain. He was afraid of vulnerability. Weeks passed. Eleanor started coming not just for duty, but to read to him. Hemingway, then Steinbeck. He never replied, but he always opened his eyes when she walked in. One night, during a power outage at the hospital, she sat beside him, with only a flashlight casting shadows across his hollow face. Out of nowhere, he spoke voice raspy. "You shouldn't love someone like me. Part of me died in the jungles of Quang Tri." Eleanor didn't know what to say. She simply placed her hand on his rough, scarred ice cold and said nothing. They sat like that for hours. For the first time, he didn't pull away. Then one day, he received orders to redeploy. He said nothing about goodbye, just scribbled a line in the back of a book she'd left behind. "If you're still willing to wait for a broken man, I'll come back." Eleanor didn't hesitate. She called home, quit school, and signed on as a full-time nurse. 3 days later, they held a small wedding in the hospital's conference room. No flowers, no guests, just a chaplain and 2 nurses as witnesses. He wore his uniform. She wore a plain white dress. They kissed under a flickering fluorescent light. Immediately after, he boarded a military transport truck headed back to war. Eleanor stood watching, gripping the thin silver wedding band she'd just put on less than an hour ago. As the truck disappeared, she whispered, "I fell in love with a soldier, and I had no idea that meant falling in love with his absence." Their story didn't begin in peace. It began in smoke, in chaos, and in a promise that had no guarantees. But in that moment, she had made her choice and never looked back. Winter in Colorado, 1973, was bitter cold. The wind howled through the cracks of the rundown rental house at the end of a dirt road. Eleanor held her 4-month-old son tightly against her chest for warmth. On the table sat the 12th envelope of the year, containing yet another postcard, still alive. "Doing okay. Kiss the baby for me. No name, no return date. No, I love you." She placed the postcard into a wooden box already full of unanswered letters. Every letter she wrote began the same way: "Dear John, I'm still okay today, but I miss you so much, I could go mad." She told him everything: how the baby had started rolling over, how the porridge burned, how long the shadows stretched each night without him. The 70s were hard years in America. Disillusionment after the war, protests, broken families. But Eleanor didn't care about headlines. She didn't need a nation to believe, she just needed John to keep his promise and come home. By the time their second child was born, she had taken a night shift at the clinic. Days were for the kids. Nights were for work. Sleep came in minutes, not hours. Once she fell asleep, while mixing formula, waking only when the baby cried hoarsely from hunger. She scooped him up, rocking and sobbing as guilt drowned her. She wasn't even 25 and already felt ancient. One night, the outside temperature dropped below 10 degrees. The heater gave out. Cold seeped through the walls. Eleanor wrapped all the blankets around her sleeping children. She herself wore 3 layers and drank hot water instead of eating dinner. That night, she wrote in her journal, "If John knew we were living like this, would he still choose to be gone?" She never sent that question. Deep down, she knew John didn't leave because he wanted to. He left because serving was all he knew how to do. But sometimes, even that understanding couldn't keep her from breaking. One March afternoon, after a 14-hour shift, she returned home to find her youngest daughter burning up with fever. The baby was limp and hot as fire. Eleanor rushed her to the hospital, sitting in the waiting room all night with the child in her arms. When the doctor finally said, "Good thing you brought her in." An hour later, it could have been critical. She just gave a tired smile. She didn't have a husband to panic with, to cry to blame. She only had herself. That same week, another postcard arrived. The same words. Same silence in return. Still alive. Still okay. Still no reply to the pain that was quietly eating her alive. The worst came one summer afternoon. She hadn't eaten or slept in nearly 2 days. While scrubbing the kitchen, she collapsed on the floor. Her eldest son, barely 10, ran next door for help. Then he boiled noodles, fried 2 sausages, and served dinner for the whole family. When Eleanor woke, her son sat beside her, watching the pot holding her hand. She burst into tears, not from pain, but shame. She felt like she had failed her children while chasing the shadow of a man. A man who wasn't there, didn't know what they were going through, and maybe, just maybe, had forgotten her. That night, Eleanor didn't write a letter. She opened her journal and scrawled her hand, shaking, "I am breaking, but I can't fall. I am their entire world. I'm the only thing in this house that hasn't disappeared." The next morning, she put her wedding ring back on the one she had taken off and stuffed in a drawer 2 weeks earlier. She looked in the mirror. Gray strands had begun to appear in her hair, though she wasn't yet 30. But her eyes, they were sharp as blades. She wouldn't wait anymore, not as a fragile woman. She would live, raise her children, keep the fire burning. And if John was still alive, he would one day know that she wasn't just the wife of a soldier. She was the only soldier in that house who had been fighting every single day without rest. John returned one September afternoon after nearly 2 decades of serving through bullets, bombs, and scorching Middle Eastern sand. He stood at the doorstep of their home, wearing a faded Marine Corps jacket, gripping an old duffel bag stamped U.S. Marines. The kids stood behind Eleanor, hesitant. Her heart pounded like the first time she met him back in the hospital. But the moment their eyes met, she knew. The man standing there was no longer the John Carter she had once loved. His eyes weren't shelter, they were voids. Cold, lost. He didn't hug her, didn't ask anything, just nodded and stepped inside. Eleanor spoke first, but all he gave back were clipped replies. "Fine, tired, don't worry." He sat for hours by the window, staring blankly toward the hills like he was still guarding some invisible trench. That first night, he slept alone, faced the wall. When she reached out and touched his shoulder, he bolted upright, screaming eyes wild, soaked in sweat. The children cried out in fear. Eleanor froze, not just in sadness, but in shock, in grief, in helpless love. And then it repeated, day after day. He wouldn't speak, wouldn't eat with the family, shut his door, turned off. The lights didn't leave the house for weeks. On the 4th of July, when fireworks began crackling across town, John suddenly smashed. His glass dropped to the floor, clutching his head. "They're behind us. Fire lower. They're behind us." Eleanor rushed to him, but he shoved her away, eyes not recognizing her at all. That night, their second daughter came into Eleanor's room and asked, "Does Daddy still love you?" Eleanor pulled her close and held her tight, but didn't answer. She stayed awake until dawn, sitting beside the man she once called husband, now trembling in a nightmare he couldn't wake from. She opened the Bible. Her voice trembled, but never broke, as she read verse by verse, line by line. Not because of religion, but because she needed to believe love could do what medicine couldn't: keep someone from falling apart. In the weeks after John began sitting at the dinner table again, he didn't speak, didn't look up, but he was there. And for Eleanor, that was a small miracle. The kids barely dared to breathe. One night she found him slumped over the kitchen table, his hands trembling. She reached for his shoulder, prepared to pull back, but he grabbed her hand, tight, and then like a child, he broke down in tears. Sobbing, gasping, "I don't deserve forgiveness," he choked. "I left you too long. I failed our kids. I don't even know who I am anymore." Eleanor didn't say, "It's okay." She didn't say, "I understand." She said only this: "I never waited for a perfect man, John. I just waited for you to come home." From that night on, they sat together. They didn't need to talk. They just needed to be there. John started mowing the lawn, taking grandkids to the park, watching TV beside Eleanor. What moved her most was the day their youngest child, the only one born after John had deployed, said, "I want to join the military. Not because of Dad, but because I've seen Mom. And she's the bravest person I know." Eleanor hugged her son, tears falling in waves. Not because he wanted to go, but because, after all these years, someone had finally seen her, really seen her. The sacrifices, the strength, the years of holding everything together alone. She didn't need medals. She didn't need speeches. She just needed that someone to say, "You kept this family alive." Washington, D.C., autumn of 2021. The sky was clear and golden leaves drifted gently across the path leading into the National Mall. In front of the Lincoln Memorial, a grand ceremony was held to honor America's longest-serving veterans. Rows of chairs were perfectly aligned. American flags waved at every corner. John Carter, then 76, was announced last. The MC introduced him as the Marine who fought in 3 wars: Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. One of the last surviving men with over 2 decades of continuous combat service. Eleanor's entire family was there. 4 children, 8 grandchildren, all dressed in matching white and navy blue, sitting in the 3rd row. Eleanor sat on the right, wrapped in the same shawl John had given her on their wedding day. She didn't expect anything different from the countless ceremonies before. Too many medals, too many names, too many speeches that never quite knew how she had kept the Carter name alive all those years. The MC invited John to the stage, but he didn't move. Everyone turned. The invitation was repeated. Still, he remained seated. A heavy pause settled over the crowd. No one understood what was happening. Then suddenly he stood. But instead of walking toward the stage, he stepped down. Whispers rippled through the audience. Cameras turned, capturing every slow, deliberate step of the old soldier walking past the rows of guests. John stopped in front of Eleanor. She sat frozen, confused. He knelt, pulling from his jacket a small silver ring box, the wedding ring she'd once taken off in 1980, then quietly worn again, night after night, gripping it like a lifeline. His voice trembled, but his words rang clear. "All my life, I was trained to fight to protect, but no one ever taught me how to be a husband. I left you alone. I stayed silent too long. Today, in front of everyone, I want to say you saved me. Not on a battlefield, but in the only place I was truly lost in love. The entire auditorium went still, and then applause. Thunderous rising. Not for the man who had survived, but for the woman who had made that survival worth something. Eleanor said nothing. She simply rose, placed her hand on his cheek, and nodded. Her eyes held no blame, no bitterness, only one thing: forgiveness. After the ceremony, someone asked Eleanor if she wanted to make a speech. She smiled and said, "I don't need people to remember my name. I just need him to remember it." That night, in a modest hotel near the national park, the entire family gathered for a simple dinner. Eleanor told her story, really told it for the first time. Every child, every grandchild listened. No one looked away. No one thought of her as just the strong mom anymore. They all understood she was the foundation, the memory keeper, the heart. She was the real hero of the Carter family. Christmas 2022. Eleanor decided to host the reunion in the same wooden house in Colorado, where she had raised 4 children, waited for letters, and cried herself dry without ever knowing if her husband was alive or dead. Snow blanketed the yard. Warm yellow light poured through the window panes, making the house feel like a world entirely separate from the cold outside. Inside, the smell of cinnamon pies, roast chicken, and spiced cider filled the air. Everything about it whispered just 2 words: family. John was much weaker now. He no longer remembered each grandchild by name, no longer spoke in full sentences. But his eyes always knew where Eleanor was in the room. He still looked for her like an instinct that time couldn't erase. The children whispered to one another, "Maybe this is the last Christmas." No one dared say it out loud. No one wanted it to be